Hi there, I'm Scott Mann. I'm a former Green Beret, keynote speaker, best-selling author, and playwright. And today on the show, we're going to talk about what if your deepest, toughest scar could actually change or save someone's life? What do Green Berets, live theater, and leadership have in common? And how are M&As parallel to building rapport in tribal society? We'll talk about that and a whole lot more. Stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. We're very happy that you're here with us. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. The war in the Ukraine may have taken your mind away from a war that the U.S. had in Afghanistan. It lasted 20 years and cost nearly $2 trillion, that's a T, dollars over 110,000 Afghanis, military, police, civilians, and 2,300 U.S. soldiers died. You can likely remember the images that you saw on TV from August of 2021 of Kabul Airport as the U.S. pulled out. And thousands of Afghanis rushed onto the tarmac of Kabul's International Airport so desperate to escape the Taliban that they were clinging to military jets as they took off. At least 7 people died in the chaos on that tarmac that day, and the crowds of people rushing the airport came from the Taliban enforcing their rule over the capital. Most of us would agree that it's important to stop being an occupied force, but none of us really, I can't say none of us, but few of us, I think, probably gave a second thought to the implications of abandoning a country, of the people in that country. Well, that's where we're going in this vast and intriguing conversation over the next 2 episodes. As always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please do us a favor and go to wherever it is you tune into your podcast from, whether that's iTunes or Apple or Google or wherever it might be. Do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It really makes a big difference to us, and we really appreciate it. And hey, if you leave a review, maybe we'll give you a shout out live on the air. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us one of the, we make us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's dive in. Our guest for the next 2 episodes is Scott Mann. He is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, and was part of the elite Green Berets for 23 years. He's done military service tours around the world, including Colombia, Iraq, and multiple tours of Afghanistan. He is a warrior storyteller and the founder of Rooftop Leadership, where he shares rapport-building skills he learned in special forces to help today's leaders make better human connections in high-stakes, low-trust engagement. On top of all that, Scott is a New York Times bestselling author of Operation Pineapple Express. That's this book right here. The book is a third-person narrative detailing the harrowing story of the veterans, volunteers, and Afghan allies who navigated the U.S. abandonment of Afghanistan in August of 2021. He has since founded Operation Pineapple Express Relief to help support the emergency needs of Afghan allies such as safe passage out of Afghanistan and plus unforeseen resettlement needs. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and Warrior Storyteller, Scott Mann.
Thanks, Doug.
Hey, Scott, it's good to have you here, mate. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I know you're a busy lad. We talked about this before we came on air. You're about to go on to a national tour with your play, and there's a lot we can get into with that. But before we do, I like to always start in the same place, because I think that a lot of us jump into our lives. We're given roles in lives. We, for instance, join the military when we're very young. We've not really thought about who we are. We don't know who we are. We end up in a business. We run a business, and we don't really know. We go to university. We don't really know. And I think that we all need to slow down a bit and look at what is the origin story that gives our lives meaning. Because when we live a life of meaning, that's when life is rich and fulfilling and we can serve. So let me ask you, what is the origin story of what gives your life meaning, Scott?
Well, thanks for having me on. And, you know, it really is a beautiful question. As a storyteller, I'm very fond of this question, and also a student of pursuing, meaning. I think it's a never-ending quest. But I think for me, I think the origin story that would best characterize kind of my journey and that I look back on is when I was 14 years old, growing up in a little logging town in Mount Ida, Arkansas. We didn't even have a stoplight in this town. And I think my graduating class was 36 people. A Green Beret walked into our soda shop where I was sitting as a 14-year-old kid, and it changed my life forever. Everything about this guy, the way he was dressed in his Class A's, his uniform that had so many ribbons, it looked like a fruit salad, and these big shiny jump boots. And he was young, his name was Mark. He was maybe 28 years old. And I went up and just talked to him because I was so enamored by this guy and how he carried himself and just kind of the way he sauntered in, unassuming. And I asked him who he was and what he did. And he sat down with me and he explained to me who he was and what he did. And he told me that he was a Green Beret out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And he went on to describe that Green Berets are elite forces and that they're formally known as special forces.
Mm-hmm.
And, I all I could get in my head was the SEALs. Like everybody seems to know who they are. And even back then, and I kept asking him, is it like a SEAL? And he said, well, not exactly. SEALs are very, very good at going in on targets and taking those targets down. They usually do the mission themselves. They're on target, off target. And he said, Green Berets are really different in the sense that they operate with 12 guys. They parachute in behind enemy lines or into at-risk areas. And then they connect at exactly the right spot with precisely the right person. It might be a village elder or a tribal chief. And then they actually immerse themselves in the language and the culture and the environment. And they stay for months, sometimes years, until the relationships are strong enough. And then they help the little guy stand up against the big guy. And for me, as this scrawny runt of a kid that pretty much flunked every tryout in sports that I tried to do and was always on the outside looking in, this was exactly what I needed to hear. This was, for me, this represented everything that I wanted to be that I wasn't. And I knew right then. I went home. I told my dad, I said, I'm going to be a Green Beret. And he's like, what is that? I said, you'll see. And I started researching and planning and preparing. And it was like I was 14. It was 28 before I finally tried out. But it never wavered for me. It never changed. I recycled probably every school in the Army twice, failed multiple times trying to get to this course. And when I finally got it, it was a tough journey, years of combat, and a lot of buddies lost. 23 of my friends were killed. But all in all, like I never wavered in my love of that notion of human connection, relationships, social capital, building trust. Mark mentored me all the way up until when I retired at 42 years old.
That's what I was just going to ask you. So you kept your relationship with Mark?
Yeah.
This
all the
guy
way up
who
my
walked
retirement.
into the soda shop when you were 14, You kept a relationship with him for 30 years?
100%.
Wow.
Yeah, I even went to see him on my senior trip because I had no life, no hobbies except going special forces. So I went to Fort Bragg, hung out with him and his team at Fort Bragg as a senior who had just graduated, and he took me to the Special Forces Museum, and he bought me a beret. He bought me a beret in the museum, and he showed me how to shape it, and he showed me how to wear it, and then he made me promise, that I would never take it off. I was actually going to show it to you. It's in here somewhere. Yeah, here it is. But I carried this beret for 10 years until I was able to try out, and then I finally put it on my head. And I never took it off. And I guess what I would end it on is, so many of us have the opportunity when a young person comes up to us and asks us, "Hey, what do you do? What's it like?" And it's so easy to be casual about that, and amongst our busy day. But I can tell you, if he had been casual with me, my life would have taken a very different turn. And I'm just so glad that he was intentional. He saw me, he was present, and him taking those few minutes to talk to me about what it means to be a Green Beret put me on a trajectory that changed my life and a lot of other lives, I think.
So in that conversation, it's interesting because there's a very clear dichotomy for me listening to that. And the dichotomy is you're part of a military force, which in the larger space is fighting an enemy. That's the idea, right? Which is death. And at the same time, your pull, based on what you just told me, is that it's about connection, which seems a dichotomy because it's about making connection with people who are potentially perceived as the enemy, and you've got to make a connection there. That's a very interesting thing to me, is that I'm trained to kill, and at the same time, I'm also trained to connect.
It's a great catch on your part. You're probably one of the few people who've ever picked up on that dichotomy to that level. And to that end, I tell people that being a Green Beret in modern times requires a very, very unique blend of character. It requires an individual who is at their foundation, able to do John Wick stuff, but who is also Lawrence of Arabia and the Verizon guy or the Sprint guy or whatever he is these days. In other words, a Green Beret has to be a relationship-based connector, but it has to be built on a degree of surgical lethality that you can turn on and off like a light switch.
Right. It's so from a psychology point of view, because that's my background, did that require a level of compartmentalization?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, the selection process that you go through just to get into special forces is extremely intense with a whole range of organizational psychologists and others who are looking at you and assessing you on a whole range of things, to include that ability to compartmentalize and to make those fluid switches where, one moment you're sitting drinking green tea with an elder who is, tickling the trigger of his AK-47. And the next minute, you're fighting for your life. And then 5 minutes later, you're back engaging, locals or treating wounded. It is a constant switch between extremes and all shades in between.
Yeah, because I mean, the whole thing around rapport is to build trust. And if you're building trust, and that has to, of course, go both ways. But at the same time, you're building trust with, let's say, an elder, but you may be in a village where you can't trust, right? So yeah. I can't even imagine the living on this really rickety balance between I've got great rapport with the elder, but there's some young lads over here who definitely don't trust us because we're American. And, so like, whoa, like you got to be really hyper vigilant and at the same time let the guard down with the person you're building rapport with.
For sure. And the origins of special forces come from the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, back in World War II, who parachuted into into Nazi occupied Europe, and then would link up with partisans and help those partisans stand up on their own. And over decades, that became the premise for the same kind of work in far-flung places around the world. Typically, the recipe was very similar, though, in that you were dealing with areas that were undergoverned, at risk, highly oppressed, either highly oppressed by totalitarian regimes, or the opposite. You had a fledgling government that was trying to hold on to some level of autonomy and legitimacy, but an insurgency in the midst that was in danger of overthrowing an organization we might view as an ally. Either way, Green Berets are thrown into that environment to go local, to make human connections, build social capital, and then mobilize people from the inside out.
Amazing. So, as I said, this is the book, Operation Pineapple Express, New York Times best-selling. It's amazing. It's a fascinating and harrowing read, because it's kind of like a journal. You're reading this point by point. But just for people who don't understand, because most people have probably not read the book, in the simplest terms, let's start with the obvious question. What is Operation Pineapple Express?
Pineapple Express was a informal code name of a group of volunteers, active duty, veterans, and a few civilians who came together during the collapse of Kabul to guide Afghan allies, mostly Afghan special operators and their families, to safety through Kabul International Airport as the country collapsed around them, using primarily relationships and an encrypted app on our phone called Signal.
So when when thinking about it from my point of view, because I'm political and I'm very sort of a news guy, I saw those Afghans in the airport in Kabul jumping on plane wheels, just doing anything they can to try and get the hell out of there. This whole thing, you were on the ground, you'd been in the ground, but when all that was going on, you were back in the United States. That's correct, right? You were already out. How long had you been out of Afghanistan at that point?
I retired in 2013. I had been selected for another command, but I did not like the way things were going in Afghanistan. Our teams had been pulled out of the villages at this point, and there was severe retribution against the elders that we had promised to stay with. And as a result of that, I hung up my boots and retired in 2013.
So 2013, that's a long way from 21, right? So when you're a long way, quite physically in the United States, but long way in time from those relationships. Had you kept any of those relationships prior to 21 when it was all collapsing?
Yeah, remember, a lot of these relationships are forged in combat, and just like relationships that you build with battle buddies from your own military, and also considering how important it was for special forces to form alliances and partnerships with our Afghan partners, whether they were villagers or whether they were commandos. You're trained from a very early age to maintain those relationships. And so I had maintained relationships in particular with a young man named Nizami, who was an Afghan commando, Afghan special forces, and was passenger number one on the Pineapple Express. And the reason that I got re-involved in this whole mess in the first place, because it was something that I never intended to get involved with again, was the war in Afghanistan. So
can we just go into a little bit of the foreign policy piece there? Because, under the Trump administration, the negotiations were made with the Taliban to pull U.S. forces out. It was 20 years. It was certainly time for them to stop being an occupied force. And let's face it, Afghanistan, the Soviets tried to do it. And the U.S. went in. People forget this, of course, because they're not as old as me, but they forget that the U.S. went in and helped the Mujahideen to defeat the Soviets. There was a lot of U.S. military equipment that got picked up by the Mujahideen, who became the Taliban and all that kind of nonsense. So Trump had said, let's get out. Okay, he negotiated that. And then Biden acted on that. He pulled out. As a man who's had his feet on the ground, talk to me a little bit about what you see that we should have done a hell of a lot better, and where is the fault in from your point of view in foreign policy with that?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness and bipartisan nature of that question. So I'm going to continue in that spirit, as I always try to do, and just answer it for what it is, which is, first of all, I made tons of mistakes as a commissioned officer in the United States Army Special Forces. I made a ton of mistakes in that country. And, that's one of the things about war is it is a foggy thing. And it's very difficult, other than looking back in hindsight to stay in front of things and oftentimes make sound decisions, policy decisions. So I want to start with that is, I had my own mistakes that I made there. But I do believe that, first of all, you cited some history. I want to add a little bit of color to this. Let's not forget that on 9/11/2001, the United States suffered the worst terror attack in our history, which was by Al Qaeda against the trade towers, the Pentagon, and another attempt that ended with a crash in Pennsylvania. All that said, one of the biggest reasons that this occurred was we knew that Al Qaeda was gathering strength. They were using Afghanistan as a safe haven to plan, project, and launch this attack. We knew it. And we did not have sufficient ground intelligence to actually substantively do anything about it. And we also had no partner force that we could leverage as a surrogate to actually interdict the action. So we relied on this over-the-horizon drone technology, which was an abysmal failure. We took several shots at bin Laden. We failed. And so the attack happened, and we were, quote unquote, strategically surprised. But the reality is we did not have the capability, intelligence, or partnership in place. So as a result of those findings in the 9/11 Commission, we brought in a whole generation of my generation of warriors who raised their right hand, less than 1% of the American population, and went over there with really the intent of putting in place an intelligence capability, a ground intel capability, and a deliberate partnership effort to build a force that was capable at the local level of attriting and serving as an antibody to Al Qaeda, which was the Afghan Special Operations Forces. Now, the broader Afghan military as well. But to your point, Dov, I mean, there was a huge element of nation building and, frankly, just wrong-headed policy approaches to trying to build a country in our image that is mostly a status tribal society. And we had no clue what we were getting into. And frankly, every single administration that prosecuted this war, I found to be remarkably underwhelming in terms of their understanding of the dynamics of that country and what really made that country tick. In my assessment, and I said this to the House Foreign Affairs Committee when I testified a few weeks ago, they asked me, they said, "Do you think we should have stayed?" And I said, "Congressman, I do. I think we should have stayed, but it should have been what should have been in the beginning, which was a small footprint of counter-terror forces and Green Berets and other advisors who would help build over 50 to 75 years a standing capability within Afghanistan to deter violent extremist groups that are on the rise." And you could do that with a small footprint. We've done it in Colombia, the Philippines, all over the world. But we don't have to have 100,000 18-year-old kids in body armor to do that. And that's my position on it. I think once we got away from that, which was very early on in the war, we started trying to make this thing it was almost like Vietnam Part 2. We
were trying to make it in our image.
Yeah.
Which was, I mean, the U.S., let's be honest, the U.S. has failed at this miserably many, many, many times we try to say, well, we're the best, so you should be like us. And we don't pay attention to cultural differences that have got nothing to do with democracy or not democracy. It's just like, that's not how we operate.
Correct.
It's like going to some village in China and giving everybody a knife and fork. We're like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah. Or looking at a country like Afghanistan that's mostly agrarian and say, they need John Deere tractors. That's what they need. Let's just get some John Deere tractors in there. And then 3 months later, they're all on the side of the road with all the tires gone and the gas siphoned out. I mean, the reality is we did not understand the operational environment. We did not understand the context by which we were operating. And we tried to come top down into a bottom up country where community-based engagement is really the norm. And I see this all over the world today in business and corporate engagements where we don't understand the local dynamics. And so we just try to project a square peg into a round hole, and we end up with secondary and tertiary consequences that are catastrophic. And that is exactly what happened in Afghanistan.
That's a very good point. So and in many ways, that's a great way for us to understand how this, because this is a leadership show, and we've had many, if you're a regular listener, you know this, we've had many military people on, and oftentimes the military strategy doesn't work in the leadership space, and very much of what you're saying here, Scott, I'm empowered by, because it's really saying, if you're a global company, or you're doing your M&As and you're going into different cultures, and you're trying to force your American culture onto this culture that is existing in Japan or Asia or some other part of Asia or Africa or India, wherever it may be, you may likely bang up against a bloody big wall, not because people are trying to be obstinate or in some way adversarial, but because you're not bothering to pay attention to how do you guys do it.
Absolutely. So well said. And, my mantra has been, for decades now, and I tell business leaders this all the time, particularly those that have to go into, at-risk communities or places that are struggling, is go local or go home. Because if you're not going to establish a local connection and you can't articulate the context of what's happening back to the affected person, they're not going to feel psychologically safe enough or connected enough to come along with you anyway. So you've really just created a social insurgent to what you're doing, and they're going to bleed you dry. They're going to bleed you out, death of a thousand cuts. And, I've spent my whole life around insurgencies. And if I've learned anything, it is meet people where they are, not where you want them to be. And if you start there, there's a decent chance that you can move things forward. But without that, it's just going to end badly.
So just give that as a practicality in the context of, this American organization, very successful, doing well, has done an M&A, has moved into somewhere in Asia or wherever it might be. What's the basic thing they need to do? Because what I'm hearing is they need the Green Berets of their organization to go in and build rapport.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, here's how we're doing it.
Absolutely. I think that's even true. It's an interesting analogy, but that's really what Rooftop Leadership, that's why I founded it, because I saw that even within organizations that were doing, these M&As within their own new culture, you had these subcultures where the leadership had no clue what it is that was going on at the street level with these acquisitions. And as a result of that, when you change things, here's what, I've spent most of my adult life studying, as you have, human dynamics under stressful situations. And, when we invoke change on a human, regardless of their socioeconomic status, they go primal. They worry about scarcity, and they worry about status, scarcity and status, and they go into a primal state of fear-based behavior. And so if we don't engage humans when that happens and bring their emotional temperature down to a parasympathetic state and help them see beyond the PowerPoint slides of organizational change and actually new patterns for the brain and what it looks like on the other side, then they're going to go back to those old story maps, those old patterns of the last acquisition that was a suck fest. And that's what they're going to live into. And so I don't even think you have to go into another country. I think just the M&A that you talked about alone, if we don't take a local contextual approach to what those individuals are actually experiencing at a psychological human connection level, you'll just dance right over them. And they're not
absolutely.
coming. They're not coming.
I see this all the time with companies I'm working with. There's a company I've been working with. They were in the pharmaceutical technology area, and they've gone global. But but part of the problem is they're having problems even inside of the United States, because as I said, today more than ever, the United States culturally is multiple different countries. Culturally, absolutely. If you can't say that the person you're going to be dealing with from Arkansas is going to respond exactly the same way as the person from New York City, or is going to respond the same way as somebody even from Idaho. So it's like, why don't, and we got to end this part one of the show, but why do you think we don't bother to do that really it's intelligence, right? Why don't we bother to do that intelligence?
I think there's a lack of social intelligence on that. One of the things that we teach in our qualification course, and I'll wrap this quickly, is, one of the first things that's overlooked in local engagement is, rather than just to spew your agenda and what your objectives are, you've got to get the other party ready to listen. You have to get the party in a state of mind where they're actually ready to listen to what the hell you have to say. And the only way to do that is to create a level of empathy and reciprocity where they feel psychologically safe enough and connected enough to open their ears and actually listen to what you have to say. And that takes a level of interpersonal skill that most of today's business leaders are not willing to take the time to do.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's one of the great failings of leadership today, is that when I was a lad, people were in the leadership role. They were a CEO for 10, 15 years. Now they're 3-4 years. They're like, oh, well, I just got to get the profits up and I'm out into the next place. And it doesn't build those relationships. And that's a big downfall. Scott, this is an amazing conversation. I'm loving it. Thank you for being with us. Please, we're going to come back in part 2. We're coming towards the end of part 1. So please tell people where they can find out more about you, about Rooftop Leadership, and all of your wonderful resources.
Yeah, thank you. If you go to scottmann.com, it's all right there. Operation Pineapple Express, Rooftop Leadership, and even our play, Last Out, Elegy of a Green Beret, that we're doing to support veterans. It's all right there at scottmann.com.
Fantastic. And of course, we'll make sure that all the social media links and all those things are, including that, are posted in the show notes. So if you didn't catch it, don't worry. It's right there in the show notes. Just go to wherever you're listening to the podcast and you'll find it there. We're going to be back in just one click for more of our delicious conversation with the Warrior Storyteller, Scott Mann, author of Operation Pineapple Express. We'll be back in just one click. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.